Yes, so today we're going to talk about context receivers. Context receivers are a new function, a new feature in Kotlin 1.6.20. I'll show what you can do with it, how it works. I'll start with an example that's really about the, it's just a basic example to show what it does. And then later I'll move on to an example that shows more of a real life scenario where you could use it and share some thoughts along the way. Still an experimental feature, so it's really good to learn about it, to try it in your hobby projects, speak about it on conferences, but probably good to wait a bit with actually implementing it in production. So who am I? I'm Pelle. I'm a solutions architect at Quinn. I've been doing software development for about 10 years, mostly in JVM-based languages and now Kotlin. Been doing that for about 2.5 years at Quinn now. It's been a really interesting journey seeing that grow from a very small company to what it is now, and learned a lot about technology and about people. But that's not what I'm talking about today. It's about the context receivers. So I have a basic example, one that is used quite often. It's about loggers. It's just a couple of functions here. We have a greet people function where we can say hello Amsterdam, and we have another function which also takes a logger. There are different ways you can do this, and maybe just creating one and passing it along methods is not the best way. There's one way that we can do that. And you might imagine there being a lot more of these kinds of functions, and all take a log and pass a log along, and it kind of messes up the signatures of your functions. So you can start to think, like, what do we actually want to say if we have a function which is called greet people? What we want to do? And the thing that we care the most about is the message. The message is the thing that we want to log and want to show. And the logger is just a thing that we need to have, otherwise we cannot do this. But we care a little bit less about it. So what can we do? Suppose that we're in Java world, then we don't have these plain functions. One thing that we could do is just create a class around it. So we can create a greeting service. We could pass along a logger here. We could also just instantiate it as a variable here, but that's not what I'm doing now. And of course, we need to create it then. And use it over here. Now we don't need this log anymore. Because we have that as a field of class. We don't need it here anymore. Cool. So now the greet people actually says what we wanted to say, which is it does something with a string value. But now we have created another class, we created a service, we created, you can imagine that if you have a lot more of these services, then maybe you'll need to inject them, and to use that greet people, you need to do some work. So are there other ways that we could do this? Well, we could, in theory. We know Kotlin, so we can use extension functions, right? Extension functions are good for everything. So let's use an extension function here, and we define these on logger. Then we don't need one step back. because there's one thing I forgot. With Kotlin, we have the with keyword, or the with function. And we can make this even a little bit nicer. Do with greeting service. Who here is familiar with the with function? Pretty much everyone. So essentially what you're doing here is you're putting the greeter service as a receiver, so that the methods that you then call, you are calling them on a receiver that you specify over here. Cool. But I was talking about extension functions, so we could do this with extension functions. And then we are in the context of a logger, so we have the logger as a receiver for these functions, so you don't need the log dot. You just call it on here. And we no longer have the greeting service here. We have a log. And we no longer have the greeting service. And this kind of looks nicer, because now we have we say that, well, we just need to have a log somewhere as a receiver. But we don't really care about it that much. And here, when we do the greet people, we care just about the argument that we give it. However, if we look at this now looks a little bit weird, because why are we doing greet people on a logger? We're communicating something which we don't really want to communicate. And also, if you look at, for example, the read out random fact, it's not the logger that's doing the reading. It's just something that we need to have in the context. So now we have context receivers. Context receivers are a new syntax that we could use for this. So instead of writing logger.greetPeople, we can have a context with a logger over here. This is just how you write that. And this does basically the same thing. So you have a logger as a receiver. So these functions that you call here, they are resolved on this logger, and does the same thing as here. And as you see, if you go a little bit up, it still compiles. So it still knows where to get that greet people from, which is this log object. So in this way, you can also have multiple ones. You can also have something else. You could still have like the greeting service here or something. That would work fine. It would just resolve either one of those. Maybe you can also already see some of the issues that can come out of this. It's pretty difficult with naming. Naming is going to be very important when you're doing things with context receivers, because you have a lot more chances of actually creating naming conflicts. And the compiler cannot really resolve these naming conflicts, so then you really have a problem. So how do we solve that? Because it could be that we later introduce another context, and in that other context, we might also have an info function, and then we have a problem. The recommended approach to solve this is to actually create a custom interface, just create interface logging context. And instead of actually putting the logger in the context, we put the logging context in the context. Now, obviously, it cannot resolve the info function anymore, so we do log.info instead. We can do the same thing here. And now this works. So this is saying exactly what we wanted to say. It's saying we want to do something with the message, but we need to have something in the context, which is the logging context. We still have a problem here, which is, well, we don't have a context receiver for the logging context because we only have a log. So then we need to create one. Several ways that it can do that, but I will just instantiate an anonymous inner class here. And then put a logging context. And now it compiles. Cool. All right. Any questions so far? Yes?
Yes? Test. Why don't you use labels instead of an interface?
Labels?
Yeah, add and then a class names to resolve the log method.
Yes. So the question is, why not use labels instead of anonymous inner class or subclass? So instead of, you could not use logging context at all and just use a logger, for example. And instead of, if you would have a conflict here, then you could do like this and say logger.info. And this would work as well. But you would need to make sure that you do not forget this kind of thing. And one of the scenarios that can happen is that you have two completely unrelated contexts that you've defined, and it's just different use cases, but they happen to come together in a function somewhere. And then if you make a name change in one of those functions, in one of those contexts, then that can have an impact on completely a different side of your application where everything breaks because you now have naming conflicts over there. So unless you always use this and always say this at thing, then there's a risk of creating these kinds of conflicts, and it's better to then just use the context. Also, it communicates quite clearly what the class is supposed to do.
Thank you.
Testing too. Why don't you use, in this case, you're saying that we want to use extension functions before you're making your case for the context receivers. Have you also considered using a extension property where you define a log, generic log? So a logger factor get logger this class.java, and then define the getter. Then you have it globally available everywhere, and then you don't need the context. And it's also cleaner, I think.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Do you mean that you would use a different way of creating the logger and then you don't need context at all?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question.
Is that like kind of like the problem they're trying to solve, but in a different way then? Or?
Right. So this example was also to show like what is a context receiver and how does it work. But I found that in quite a lot of situations, using like these kind of contexts as a kind of dependency injection or for like injecting like loggers or things like that, we already have ways of doing that, right? And I think you were mentioning one of those ways. Yeah. So I think maybe this is a good moment to move on to my second example then, because that will give a more real-life example of how you could use it and where I believe it will be a little bit more useful than it is over here.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I'll try that example then, and then there will be more time for questions, hopefully. Yeah, so I've used an example of something in Ktor. For those who are unfamiliar with Ktor, this is just how you define a couple of endpoints. So there's a getter for getting appointments for a user, and we have a post endpoint where you can create a new endpoint for a user. This is just to make sure that we have a valid job token where there's some information about the user that like a user ID and a username and maybe a locale. And this will throw if the user is not authenticated or you don't have a token, valid token. And in Ktor you have this application call object, and that you can use to get things from the request, but also to put things into the response, and things like that. One thing I've noticed in one of our applications at Quinn is we have an application that does everything it does in the context of a user. So you will always have this user around, and sometimes you care about it, and sometimes a little bit less. But a lot of functions all over the code base use this user, and you pass it along everywhere, and it goes everywhere. So yeah, then we can think maybe we just learned what context receivers are, right? So can we use it here? We can look at it. We have this appointment service, and in there we have a couple of methods, and that use the user. And this user is just a user ID and username and locale, and you can implement something like authenticated user that gets it from the JOT token and creates such a user object. So instead of writing user here, we write context user context. I've already created a user context, so this is just the authenticated user, which is similar to the login context that we created earlier. And then we do authenticated user.user ID. And because we're in this context, we can just do that user ID thing over here. Now at the application call side, we get this error again because we don't have this context receiver. So we can do the same thing. We can use user context. Probably, right. Cool. Then we can say with this authenticated user, with this user context, we do this thing. Then we don't use the user here. Cool. So this would work as well. And here we have a situation where it's well, we just want to get our appointments right, and we are doing everything in the context of a user. So it's obvious that you're using your own appointments. But even if it's like not obvious enough, you can maybe change the method name if you want to. But is this really better? We still have this ugly thing over here, right? But the fun thing is that in a lot of cases you can refactor this away and hide that in helper methods that you can define. So I've created one for this application call. So you can do with authenticated user. I'll show what it does exactly. And then I can move this over there. Remember, we have this, we get the authenticated user, we create this user context, and within the user context we call these things. And if we look at what this method does, it does exactly that. So we have the authenticated user, create the user context, and run this function. So this function is this function with, and we pass the context. Note that also for anonymous functions or named function parameters, we can use this user context with the same syntax. So that means that when you actually run this, then with the authenticated user, inside here you are in the user context. And now this looks kind of neat. Also, one thing to note is that if you look over here, In theory, you could also, when you have a function which is in the user context, then you can call other functions which are in the user context as well. So if instead of actually passing user ID here, we pass the user, and we do that in the same way, which we say like user context. User context. Then we don't need to pass this, and we can use the authenticated user ID here. Right. And this just works because we're in this context. If we're not in the context, then it throws an error. If we are in a context, it works. So that would save a bit of calls here and there. You could still ask the question, is this really something that you want to do? I think that's a very good question to ask with context receivers in general. Probably good not just go look for use cases and try it everywhere. Really let the use cases find you. There are quite a few out there. I don't really have time to go in all of those. So for DSL building, it can be very useful to have multiple of these kind of contexts. Also for very specific use cases like this, it might be useful. But it also has dangers because you are hiding the fact that you're doing something with the user, and you're assuming that this is clear from the context and also from not only from the compile context, but also from the understanding of the reader context. Yeah, any questions? I think an area.
Thank you. Actually, I'm asking about how can I overload that context if I want to pass more context argument, and what is the scope of the context? Can I just use it once, or it has to be on top of each method or function?
Yeah, good question. So this context object, right? The question is how we can actually, if we can reuse that, or do we need to construct it every time, things like that. You can just, it's just an object, so you can use it whenever you want, and the way that it gets used is with this, with the with call. I'm actually not using a with over here. I'll get to that a little bit later. Yeah, so it's just an object that you're using, and whenever you have the methods that you're calling inside of this context, it's using that object, that specific instance of the object. So if you want it to be different every time, then you need to create it every time. If you want it to be global and static and only create it once, then you need to create it once. This is just syntax for creating such an object. So this is just, you could also have, for lack of a better name, user context impl. And then put it over here. And just instantiate it here. You could do something like that. Also, an interesting way that you could do this, if you have multiple of these, so if you do not have just a user context, but we also have this logging context, we can actually extend two at the same time. And then we have here like overall if I'll log something. Probably good if you don't do this too often, but if you're using it in one place, then it could be easy syntax. And then we can have like a logging context here as well. So this shows off that you can actually have multiple contexts at the same time. And what is it complaining about? Right to do. And so unreachable code. You just need to. Yeah. So. Last thing is that what we would want to write here probably is, okay, with this context, call this function, right? Unfortunately, this doesn't work at the moment. So the way that these contexts get compiled into Java code is by just passing them as parameters. But when you're using them as a function parameter, then you actually need to pass those contexts explicitly. And since we have two contexts here, which happen to be the same object, we need to do that way. Does that answer the question? If you want to use it on top of a function, let's see if we have the. Let's see if I understand correctly. In this case, we get the user from the request, so we need to put this everywhere because otherwise we do not have that context. In this case, you put it on top of the function because we are using it over here. You might, if you have like a bigger architecture, just have one main function and define everything over there. And then define it once, pass it along to the first function. Because as you see in the appointment service here, once we have this context, we can just use it here and we can use it here. You do need to define that you're in that context, but you can just continue from there. All right, so that was it. If you have any more questions, then come find me at the booth or anything else. Thank you.